and sniffed quite like a dog. "I must look into this," said she, and disguising herself as a toad, she crept unseen into the pipe by which the copper emptied itself into the palace moat, for of course there was a copper in one of the palace cellars, as there always is in cellars in the North Country. Now this copper had been a great trial to the decorators. If there is anything you don't like about your house, you can either try to conceal it or make a feature of it. And as concealment of the copper was impossible, it was decided to make it a feature by covering it with green moss and planting a tree in it, a little apple tree all in bloom. It had been very much admired. Malevola, hastily altering her disguise to that of a mole, dug her way through the earth that the copper was full of, got to the top, and put out a sharp nose, just as Benevola was saying in that soft voice which Malevola always thought so affected: "The princess shall love and be loved all her life long."
"So she shall,"
said the wicked fairy, assuming her own shape amid the screams of the audience.
"Be quiet, you silly cuckoo,"
she said to the Lord Chamberlain, whose screams were specially piercing,
"or I'll give you a christening present too."
Instantly there was a dreadful silence. Only Queen Eliza, who had caught up the baby at Malevola's first word, said feebly, "Oh, don't, dear Malevola." And the King said,
"It isn't exactly a party, don't you know? Quite informal. Just a few friends dropped in, eh, what?"
"So I perceive,"
said Malevola, laughing that dreadful laugh of hers which makes other people feel as though they would never be able to laugh any more.
"Well, I've dropped in too. Let's have a look at the child."
The poor Queen dared not refuse. She tottered forward with the baby in her arms.
"Humph,"
said Malevola.
"Your precious daughter will have beauty and grace, and all the rest of the twopenny halfpenny rubbish those niminy piminy minxes have given her, but she will be turned out of her kingdom. She will have to face her enemies without a single human being to stand by her, and she shall never come to her own again until she finds—"
Malevola hesitated. She could not think of anything sufficiently unlikely.
"Until she finds,"
she repeated.
"1,000 spears to follow her to battle,"
said a new voice.
"1,000 spears devoted to her and to her alone."
A very young fairy fluttered down from the little apple tree where she had been hiding among the pink and white blossom.
"I am very young, I know," she said apologetically, "and I've only just finished my last course of fairy history. So I know that if a fairy stops more than half a second in a curse she can't go on, and someone else may finish it for her. That is so, your Majesty, isn't it?"
she said, appealing to Benevola. And the Queen of the Fairies said yes, that was the law, only it was such an old one most people had forgotten it.
"You think yourself very clever," said Malevola, "but as a matter of fact you're simply silly. That's the very thing I've provided against. She can't have any one to stand by her in battle. So she'll lose her kingdom and every one will be killed. And I shall come to the funeral. It will be enormous," she added, rubbing her hands at the joyous thought.
"If you've quite finished,"
said the King politely.
And if you're sure you won't take any refreshment, may I wish you a very good afternoon?'
He held the door open himself, and Malevola went out chuckling. The whole of the party then burst into tears.
'Never mind,'
said the King at last, wiping his eyes with the tails of his ermine.
'It's a long way off, and perhaps it won't happen after all.'
But of course it did. The King did what he could to prepare his daughter for the fight in which she was to stand alone against her enemies. He had her taught fencing and riding and shooting, both with the crossbow and the long bow, as well as with pistols, rifles, and artillery. She learned to dive and to swim, to run and to jump, to box and to wrestle, so that she grew up as strong and healthy as any young man, and could indeed have got the best of a fight with any prince of her own age. But the few princes who called at the palace did not come to fight the Princess, and when they heard that the Princess had no dowry except the gifts of the fairies, and also what Malevola's gift had been, they all said they had just looked in as they were passing, and that they must be going now, thank you, and went. And then the dreadful thing happened. The tradesman, who had for years been calling for the last time before, etc., really decided to place the matter in other hands. They called in a neighbouring king, who marched his army into Ozymandias's country, conquered the army (the soldiers' wages hadn't been paid for years), turned out the king and queen, paid the tradesmen's bills, had most of the palace walls papered with the receipts, and set up housekeeping there himself. Now, when this happened, the Princess was away on a visit to her aunt, the Empress of Oricalchia, half the world away, and there is no regular post between the two countries, so that when she came home, travelling with a train of 54 camels, which is rather slow work, and arrived at her own kingdom, she expected to find all the flags flying, and the bells ringing, and the streets decked in roses to welcome her home. Instead of which, nothing of the kind. The streets were all as dull as dull, the shops were closed because it was early closing day, and she did not see a single person she knew. She left the 54 camels laden with the presents her aunt had given her outside the gates, and rode alone on her own pet camel to the palace, wondering whether perhaps her father had not received the letter she had sent on ahead by carrier pigeon the day before. And when she got to the palace and got off her camel and went in, there was a strange king on her father's throne, and a strange queen sat in her mother's place at his side. "Where's my father?" said the Princess, bold as brass, standing on the steps of the throne. "And what are you doing there?"
I might ask you that, said the King. Who are you, anyway?
"I am the Princess Ozyliza," said she.
Oh, I've heard of you, said the King. You've been expected for some time. Your father's been evicted, so now you know. No, I can't give you his address.
Just then some one came and whispered to the Queen that 54 camels, laden with silks and velvets and monkeys and parakeets and the richest treasures of Oricalchia, were outside the city gate. She put two and two together and whispered to the King, who nodded and said, "I wish to make a new law." Every one fell flat on his face. The law is so much respected in that country. "No one called Ozyliza is allowed to own property in this kingdom," said the King. "Turn out that stranger." So the Princess was turned out of her father's palace, and went out and cried in the palace gardens, where she had been so happy when she was little. And the baker's boy, who was now the baker's young man, came by with the standard bread, and saw some one crying among the oleanders, and went to say, "Cheer up," to whoever it was. And it was the Princess. He knew her at once. 'Oh, Princess!'